The US and China are the two leading economies in the world. But why can't China surpass the US to become the top one? Comparing the economies of the US and China is like comparing two giants in the world. One is creative, and the other is hardworking and diligent. Why can't the US surpass China to become the world's top? First, let's look at the size of the two countries' economies. In 2024, the US GDP, the total value of goods and services produced, will reach about 30,000 billion US dollars, like a super rich family with a huge income. Meanwhile, China's GDP is about 19,000 billion US dollars, and this number is only second to the US, still a very huge number. The US is a high-tech giant, selling high-value products like iPhones, software, and financial services. China is like a giant fortification, producing clothes, toys, and cheaper consumer goods. The combined GDP of the US and China accounts for more than 40% of the world's GDP. After the US and China, there are other major economies such as Japan, Germany, and India, but these economies also account for a small part. In other words, the US and China, with their combined economies, are larger than the GDP of the entire European Union, Japan, and India combined. And if divided into per capita, the US has a per capita income of $86,601 a year. This figure is equivalent to more than 2 billion VND a year. In China, it is 12,969 US dollars, nearly 13,000 US dollars. And this is a big difference. The average American earns more than 6 times the average Chinese earn. That's why, if you look at GDP alone, the total value of a country's goods and services, populous countries like China and India always look huge. But when you break that number down by person, the disparity in real living standards becomes more apparent. This helps people understand that a large population does not mean a rich people, and the same is true for the US and China. GDP per capita is also a measure of labor productivity. A country with high productivity will have each citizen create more value, leading to higher average income. And this number is not just a number, but also a comprehensive measure of wealth, of quality of life, of the level of development in a country. We have to understand the standard of living of the people instead of just looking at the size of the economy. And in both of these aspects, China is losing to the US. But it must be said that China's economy has grown very rapidly in recent years. Many people are confident that with that momentum, China's economy can surpass the US. China's economic journey over the past few decades has been a spectacular story. From a poor and backward country, it has become the second largest economy in the world, on par with the United States. In the 1970s, China was still mired in poverty. At that time, the country's GDP was only about 150 billion US dollars, and the GDP per capita was only about 200 US dollars, the lowest in the world. China was then heavily influenced by rigid, centralized planning policies where people worked for the collective and no one really enjoyed the fruits of their labor. In addition, campaigns such as the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s and early 60s, the two cultural revolutions in the late 60s and early 70s had plunged the economy into a slow recession. China was like a slow, dilapidated bullock cart while the world was rushing into industrialization. The turning point came in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up policy. This was the time when China untied its economy, moving from a bureaucratically centralized model to a controlled market economy. Special economic zones such as Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Xiamen were established as laboratories for reform ideas. Foreign investment from the US, Japan, and Western countries poured in like a flood. China knew how to take advantage of cheap labor and abundant land to become the world's factory, focusing on manufacturing industries such as garments, electronics, and toys. Thus, from 1978 to 2000, China's GDP increased from $150 billion to $1,200 billion, an increase of about 8 times in just over 20 years. In the 2000s, China really went into overdrive. After joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, it entered the global playing field with increasing power. Chinese companies not only manufactured for foreign brands, but also began to build their own giant corporations such as Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent. Industries such as steel, electronics, and solar energy quickly became the trump cards in the economy. By 2010, China had officially surpassed Japan to become the second largest economy in the world with a GDP of nearly 6,000 billion US dollars at that time. But that rise was not without its price. China is currently facing a series of problems, such as an aging population, high public debt, and economic imbalances. These problems are like a shadow that makes it more difficult than ever to change the US. However, there's no denying that in just a few decades, China has written an extraordinary economic story from a poor country. The big question is whether they can continue to grow at this rate and one day surpass the US. The answer is almost impossible. First, based on population size alone, China has a huge advantage. With over 1.4 billion people, it is the second most populous country in the world, nearly 4 times the population of the US. This means that if each Chinese person produced more or lived richer, China's total GDP would easily surpass that of the US. But in reality, despite their large GDP, each Chinese person still earns only a fraction of what each American earns. It's like a football team with a lot of players, but uneven skills, while the opponent has fewer players than an all-star team. Another important factor is technology. China is good at manufacturing, but for most of the world's high-value products like iPhones, computer software, and airplanes, the US not only makes them, but also controls the lion's share of the profits. China has been trying to catch up, but to really surpass the US, it needs to become an innovator, not a manufacturer or a copycat. Population is also a major issue facing China. After decades of the one-child policy, the number of elderly people in China is increasing rapidly, while the number of young people is decreasing. This makes the labor force increasingly shrinking, like a car running out of fuel. Meanwhile, the US population, although smaller, is younger thanks to immigration and birth rates. Therefore, the US has an abundant and creative workforce. Not only that, China is also having problems with its real estate market. They have built so many houses and urban areas that are empty, creating ghost cities. This is like a financial ghost that is growing, and if it bursts, the whole economy will be severely affected. Meanwhile, although the US has a lot of debt, it relies on more solid economic sectors, such as technology, finance, and services. China, however, is not to be dismissed as an easy sell. It is trying to focus on its domestic market, encouraging its people to consume more to reduce its dependence on exports. It is also investing heavily in future sectors, such as electric vehicles and renewable energy, which could give it a lead in the coming decades. So, can China surpass the US? Maybe, but not right away. To do that, it needs to solve its own internal problems. Meanwhile, the US still has a huge advantage in technology and innovation. And before China has a chance to race closer to the US has made smart moves to keep up with China. To keep a distance from China in the economic race, and to prevent China from surpassing, the US has been applying many smart and effective tricks. First of all, technology is once again America's most powerful weapon. They control almost every core technology in the world, from artificial intelligence, semiconductors, to aerospace. China may be good at manufacturing, but it cannot touch these pinnacle and elite fields. Typically, the field of semiconductor chip production, the brain of every electronic device. The US has imposed sanctions to limit China's access to advanced chip-making technology and equipment. US companies like Intel and Qualcomm are not only world leaders, but also control the entire supply chain. In other words, even if China wants to develop itself, it still depends on US technology. Next, the US knows how to leverage the power of its friends, its followers, its strategic alliances. While China often acts alone, the US has a large network of allies from Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India. These countries not only support the US in trade and technology, but also act as a direct counterweight to China. For example, Japan and the US have cooperated to research and produce semiconductors and move the supply chain out of China. This alliance is a strong barrier that makes it difficult for China to break through, even though China also wants to create US alliances. The US dollar is also an advantage that the US always has to maintain its leading position. The dollar is not only the main currency of the United States, but also the international reserve currency. It is used in most global trade transactions. This gives the United States a great deal of control over the world economy. When the US wants to pressure China, they can use measures such as financial sanctions, controlling the international payment system to make it difficult for China to trade with other countries. China has tried to promote the yuan as an international currency, but the position of the US dollar is still too strong. It controls all the games. In addition, the US has cleverly moved its supply chain out of China to reduce its dependence. They have moved many factories back home or to other countries such as Vietnam, India, and Mexico. This not only helps the US reduce risks, but also weakens China's role as a world fortification. A typical example is Apple, the world's largest technology company, is moving some of its production from China to Vietnam and India. This causes China to lose a large source of export revenue. And finally, the US is always at the forefront of long-term strategies. While China focuses on mega projects like highways and real estate, the US has done these things for a long time and invests heavily in education, scientific research, and human development. American universities and research institutes like MIT, Stanford, and NASA not only create breakthrough technologies, but also train a generation of high-quality workers, ensuring that the US is always ahead of China in important areas. In short, the US is not only consolidating its number one position, but also actively preventing China from surpassing it. They use technology, allies, the US dollar, and long-term strategy as secret weapons. China can advance very quickly, but when the US stops them, this race will become increasingly difficult. And you, do you think China will surpass the US one day? Thank you for following this story. If you find it interesting, you can subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share. And now I would like to say goodbye. Please feel free to leave comments, and see you soon.